So our Torah portion is called Shelach, technically Shelach L'cha, and it's taken from Numbers chapter 13, verse 1, and it goes over to the end of chapter 15. And so I'm going to begin to read in Numbers chapter 13, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, Shelach L'cha, literally go for yourselves, go see for yourselves, more or less. Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, everyone a leader among them. And so Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran, according to the command of the Lord, all of them men who were heads of the children of Israel. So we've come into those portions that we always hit in the summertime, which makes it very difficult to avoid unpleasant topics. I don't see how, I don't see any way around it. I've looked, is there something we could peel off of this and glean from this that doesn't necessarily have to address the things that are so negative? And I've come to the conclusion that apparently this is what the Father wants us to deal with during this time. And so there's something we need to hear. So it's kind of hard to get around talking about things that are quote-unquote negative when we have to talk about evil reports and unbelief and, scandal and slander and all these kinds of things. And I say that because I personally, and I know that most people, we want to hear something uplifting. We want to hear something encouraging. We want to hear some good news, right? Amen. And that's understandable. I think that's commendable. In fact, we are actually told to speak on those kinds of things. This is what Paul said, one of my wife's favorite passages that she loves to quote when I am not having a good day. Whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report. If there is any virtue and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. And of course, if we meditate on these things, we're going to share these things. We're going to say these things. So we are encouraged, we're challenged to speak in an encouraging way, which kind of sets the stage for why what happens in the Torah portion is so destructive. So even though we're to meditate on those kinds of things, I want to caution us, myself included, that there is a potential danger in desiring to hear only good things. Here's what what's written in Isaiah chapter 30, verses 8 through 10. Now go, write it before them on a tablet and note it on a scroll, that it may be for the time to come forever and ever, that this is a rebellious people. So God wanted us to know forever and ever that his people were a rebellious people. That's what he said. That's not me. That's what he said. That this is a rebellious people, lying children. Children who will not hear the law of the Lord, who say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things. Speak to us smooth things. Prophesied deceits. And so there are these two passages that kind of frame what we're going to talk about today. We are to be those who are meditating on noble things, things that are true, things that are uplifting, things that are of a good report. But then there are those people among God's people, he says, that they don't want to hear what's true. They want to hear what they want to hear. And so for this portion, for the following portion, because the next one's called Korach, perhaps you've heard of him and know a little bit about that story. We're compelled to discuss unpleasant things, but hopefully to take a message away from it that encourages us. Yeah, to be encouraged by news that isn't so encouraging, perhaps so that we can just kind of, reaffirm, to stay focused. Because, as Paul challenged us in 1 Corinthians 10, when he's discussing the children of Israel, those who left, went to the wilderness, and all the things that they got into, and all the problems that befell them, he says that all those things that were addressed there are written down for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. And so he says this in verse 12, then let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. So, Paul felt it was very important that you and I learn these lessons So as not to think that we've got it all together, but to remember these things, these pitfalls are always in front of us, and we have to be very, very careful not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And so there are some lessons in this Torah portion that I want to go through. And here's the first one that jumped out at me. We need to learn the value of following instructions. I'm just going to let that percolate for a moment. We need to learn the value of following instructions. Because you see, the spies were sent to tour the land. In fact, the word that is translated spy in Hebrew is actually pronounced tour. Interestingly enough, it means a tourist. So they're going to tour the land to see how to take the land. They were not sent to see if they were to take the land. That's very, very important. Now, Moses says, or is told, go send for yourself, which is kind of implying, go see for yourself that it is a land flowing with milk and honey. And so Moses selects these leaders of the different tribes. And so by selecting leaders, we have to think that these are people he trusted, or at the very least, these are people who are respected as leaders among the people of their tribes. But just because they're good at leading their tribe doesn't necessarily mean they're good at leading the whole assembly. Just because he had confidence in them for certain things doesn't mean that every leader always has the heart of God. Now, fortunately, there's always a remnant who do. Because among these 12, there are Hoshea or Joshua and Caleb. And both of these men witnessed the same thing that the other 10 did. But what distinguishes them is that they believed God. They believed God's promise and not necessarily what they were seeing with their eyes. They were able to see beyond that. In that sense, they're visionary, to behold what it is that God intends and what God has for us in spite of some of the obstacles that may be appearing before us right now. And so these men apparently understood the purpose of their mission. And that was not if we're to take the land, but how we're to take the land. They understood that. And so once again, we're looking at the value of following instructions. And if we're going to follow instructions faithfully, we probably need to hear those instructions. We probably need to open our ears and our hearts to hear those instructions and to embrace the intent of what is meant in those instructions. And not as we are accustomed to hear the instruction and then start looking for a loophole and how we can get around it and how we can skirt it to benefit what we think is best for us and our own agenda. So again, they were sent to determine how, not to determine if. But there's always those people who think they know a little better. There's always those people who they'll listen to the instruction or they'll hear the words that are spoken, but they think, well, I have a better idea. Or I have a different agenda. They think they are wiser than the one that is giving them the instruction. In this particular case, God through Moses. Maybe sometimes they are smarter, but that really has nothing to do with it. I'm not smarter than God, no, but the smarter than the person who's giving the instruction. And they may be more intelligent, but that doesn't really mean anything if God didn't give them that authority. That's what matters. And so then we have the situation where people couldn't discern the truth from the lie. And because they couldn't discern the truth from the lie, because they too had not really taken to heart the instruction of the Lord to go and to possess the land. They knew when they left Egypt, that's where they were headed ultimately. They knew that that's what the promise was. They knew that that was the objective. And so they knew that. But because they couldn't discern the truth that Caleb and Joshua were speaking from the lies that the other 10 were speaking, they spent the next 38 years wandering through the wilderness. So again, the point is this. It's really important to follow instructions as they are given to us, and especially if they are God's instructions, and not be like Laodicea and start looking for loopholes to get around it and think of ourselves in one way when God really sees us a different way. You remember when Saul was king, There was a time, and Samuel points this out, when you were small in your own eyes. But then you got all puffed up, and I'm paraphrasing. You got all full of yourself, and you thought that you knew better. And you just started kind of doing things the way you did because, it's good to be the king, all right? Sometimes it's not when you're the one that God put there to lead his people, and he expects you to follow his instructions because his people are looking to you for leadership. So again, it's very important to follow instructions. And Saul did to a degree, but then there came those times when he thought, well, I got a better idea. I think I'll do it this way. Remember when he's told to go and slay the Amalekites, all of them, don't leave any of them, not one of them, and don't take any of their livestock or any of that kind of stuff. Remember? Saul had a better idea. So in 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel the prophet comes to him and says, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices? Because we always, when we have a better idea, we want to do what we want to do. Well, I just was doing this to please the Lord. The Lord told me this, and the Lord told me. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. I have sacrificed so much for the kingdom. I have sacrificed so much for the Lord. I've given up pork chops. I've given up tinsel on trees and colored eggs. I've given up so much for the Lord. Obedience is better than sacrifice. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion, all right, so let's stop right there. What is rebellion? It's disobedience, right? For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. That's a pretty powerful statement, isn't it? Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. You know what? When we're being stubborn in order to get our own way, the scripture likens that to idolatry. It don't get much worse than that, folks. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also has rejected you from being king. So then, we should take away from this and from our Torah portion that it is not good for us to disregard the word of the Lord, to reject the word of the Lord, to fall short in the instructions that he's given to us. And now we're talking about people who are being belligerent, who are being intentional, people who are, I've got a better way, I've got a better plan, I want to do things my way. We're not talking about doing things necessarily in ignorance or, some of those kind of situations, because we all fall short. But you understand what I'm saying. It is not good for us to just reject the word of the Lord and think we can do it better or we have a better way. It's not good for us to reject the instructions the Lord gives us. And it's not good for us to go beyond what he has told us. It's just as bad if we go beyond what he's told us as it is to fall short of what he's told us. It's important that we do what we are told as God gives direction. And actually, we see in the Torah portion, we see in the life of Saul, that failing to do this, failing to truly heed his voice and his instruction, can be the difference between life and death. So that's one lesson. It's really important to learn the value of following instructions. Here's another lesson that I gleaned from this. Don't assume to have authority that was not given to you. Numbers 13, verse 26 through 29. Now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. This is after they've gone in and toured the land. They've gone to the valley of Eshcol. Now they're coming back. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Then they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwelt in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. So here's what I want you to notice. Moses is the one who sent them. But when they came back, who did they bring the report to? To Moses and the whole congregation. I see something kind of sinister in that. Moses sent them out with instructions, and they came back and gave a report to everybody instead of going to Moses. Not only that, but they delved into the if we should take the land rather than just staying focused on how we take the land. They, in a sense, assumed authority that had not been granted them. They assumed that it was okay for them just to share this evil report with everybody. And again, I see something sinister in that. I see a hidden agenda in that. And they assumed authority they had not been given. They briefly mentioned the positive. Yeah, Moses, it is, as you said, a land that flows with milk and honey. But what do they emphasize, really? All the reasons that we can't do this. In fact, they said we can't do this because they rejected the word of the Lord. They rejected his instruction. And as a result, the people at large, because they either didn't have the wisdom and leadership skills that we assume that they may have, or they had a hidden agenda, because see, they should have brought the information to Moses. And if they brought the information to Moses and said, well, we went and checked it out, this is what we saw, it looks pretty, tough. If they had brought it to Moses in respect to the fact that Moses is the one that sent them, then perhaps all that could have been shut down right then and there. But that's not what they did. They brought all their negativity to the people at large. They said, we can't do this. And as a result of that, the whole congregation, or most of them, the whole congregation lost faith in God, lost the willingness to go in and to fight for the land. And again, keep in mind, possessing the land was the whole objective here. Possessing the land was the ultimate goal. That's why he brought them out of Egypt in the first place. Possessing the land was their destiny. And by that I mean their purpose. And so in rejecting the word of the Lord, they're rejecting his purpose for them. And so then by presuming to speak as the authority on whether they could possess the land or not, in a sense, the 10 spies put themselves in God's seat. God said, you will possess the land. They said, we can't possess the land. So they're kind of putting themselves in God's seat, and they're overriding God's authority and the authority of the one that God appointed to lead the people. Now we know they paid dearly for this. It was pretty audacious for them to do that, and they paid the price. And I would suggest that by and large, their audacity, since I use that word, was likely fueled by fear, coupled with this lust that had been present with them all along. Let's go back to Egypt. Let's find somebody else, and let's have that person take us back to where we used to be. Now, the 10 spies apparently died almost immediately, but for the people, they were destined to wander through the wilderness another 38 years, which then brings us to lesson number 3. The danger of being unwilling to hear the truth. Numbers 14, beginning at verse 6. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, these two guys, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel. Now, this is probably something I shouldn't even say, but I'm going to do it anyway. They tore their clothes. I realize that, that's kind of an act of grief or mourning or something like that. I get that. But I've wondered, were they so upset that they thought, well, I better tear my clothes before I punch somebody? I'm serious. Because when you see somebody that is that's head down the wrong road and has the ability to take others down the wrong road, I don't know about you, but sometimes that makes me angry because I see where this is headed. Now, again, I realize that they were just, expressing, this is mournful, this is grievous what you're doing here. But I do kind of wonder, if it was like, I better do this or hit somebody. Because what was about to happen, they saw what was coming. Anyway, you can erase that from your memory banks if that doesn't resonate with you. But they tore their clothes and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. And so it's kind of like David later on, when the Philistines and Goliath, their champion, is gathered there at the Valley of Elah, and Saul and all his armies are being taunted for those 40 days and 40 nights, and nobody's going to go out to meet him. And David, this little shepherd boy, he says, I'll go, I'll face him, I'll fight him. And why was he so bold? Because he recognized that this was an uncircumcised Philistine. And he had no protection. And he had defied the armies of the living God. And so David realized that this guy, he might be big and he might be tall and he might be intimidating and he might be throwing missiles at us day and night, taunting. But he's an uncircumcised Philistine. So Caleb recognizes this. By the way, he was the prince of Judah. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. What did David tell Goliath? Today I'm going to take your head. And so all the nations will know that there is a God in Israel. That he's with us. He's not with y'all. He's with us. But all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel. And that statement there makes me wonder, if the glory of the Lord had not appeared at that moment, would the people have followed through with their threats to stone Joshua and Caleb? Now, Caleb's already been shouted down once. So it kind of makes me wonder, if he had not shown up, would they have followed through? Anyway, here's the end result of all of this. The people listened to the majority report. The people believed that even with God's help, the people of Canaan were stronger. And so that's what made it evil. They rejected the word of the Lord. And it led to other things. And this evil report was then spread throughout the camp, and it became this cancerous cell that actually consumed the entire body. Now, the gateway for this particular catastrophe was their unwillingness to believe that God could finish what he started. That, to me, that's what it boils down to. They were unwilling to believe that God could finish what he started. And that was brought on by hardship, difficulty, loss, things not going the way they thought they would go. Apparently they thought that everything was going to be easy breezy. There weren't going to be any complications, weren't going to be any challenges. They weren't going to have to be refined in any way. They thought they were just going to go and walk into the land of Canaan and all their enemies would melt before them. And it didn't work that way then. It doesn't work that way now. So let's not make the same mistake of being unwilling to believe that God will and can finish what he started. Whether me, you, us, he can and he will finish what he started. But Caleb says something earlier that if the Lord delights in us. Now, the Lord does, it seems to me anyway, the Lord's not going to delight people who are belligerent, unwilling to believe, unwilling to obey, always thinking they have a better way, got their own thing going on. I don't know that he delights in those people. He delights in people who will, in humility, walk before him, and do what he's called them to do. So again, the people listened to the majority report. They believed that the people of Canaan were stronger than the God who had led them all this way. And that idea, that mindset began to, permeate the congregation until they believed the lie instead of the truth. And then when they embraced the lie in rejecting the truth, that then provoked them to wrath. They were ready to stone the people who were telling them the truth. Which brings to mind something that Paul told the Galatians, or asked the Galatians, have I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? I realize the context is completely different, but the principle remains the same. And that is, it is dangerous for us to refuse to hear the truth. And a lot of the times, truth is difficult because it indicts our flesh, because it exposes what's really in our heart, right? And because it is hard, we want to reject it. We'd rather listen to smooth words, prophesied deceits. Obviously, again, that's very dangerous. So it is dangerous for us to refuse to hear the truth and to stop up our ears from hearing what it amounts to is what our flesh doesn't want to hear. Now here's a passage in Zechariah chapter 7, verses 11 and 12. Speaking again of his people, it says, they refused to heed, they shrugged their shoulders and stopped their ears so that they could not hear. Let me interject this thought. In 1 Samuel chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, we have the story of Hannah, and she's barren, she gets pregnant, she has a son, his name is Samuel. And in those days, there was a high priest by the name of Eli, and he had these two sons who were known as sons of Belial. They did not know the Lord, Hophni and Pinchas. And there is an unnamed prophet in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel who comes to Eli the high priest to tell him, you've got some problems here, and you have preferred your sons over me, and here's what's going to happen as a consequence of that. Eli's response was, well, the Lord needs to do whatever what seems good to him. And in my mind's eye, it's like this old high priest is kind of shrugging his shoulders. Okay, whatever. That's what he's describing here. They shrugged their shoulders, they stopped their ears so that they could not hear. Yes, they made their hearts like flint, refusing to hear the law and the words which the Lord of hosts had sent by his Spirit through the prophets. Thus great wrath came from the Lord of hosts. So then, to refuse to hear the truth, to stop up our ears, so to speak, to kind of just nonchalantly, hear it and then shrug our shoulders and go our merry way. This portion reveals that can be a position that leads to destruction. And the reason it's important for us to remember these things is because, again, Paul said, these things were written down for our admonition upon whom the ends of the ages have come. This is going to be an issue in the last days. 2 Thessalonians, again, Paul, chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. They did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. They're deceived. By the way, in Matthew chapter 24, in the Olivet Discourse, biggest problem, sign, if you will, of the last days is not who the Antichrist is and not all this, this war and that war. That's part of it. But the biggest sign the Messiah puts out there is deception. Don't be deceived. And so there are people who are deceived, because they are deceived, and because they did not receive the love of the truth, for this reason, God will send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie. In other words, you want flesh? I'll give it to you until it's coming out your nose. You want the lie? I'll let you have the lie. And in fact, you'll believe the lie if you're going to set your heart like a flint instead of setting your face like a flint to follow him. But if you're going to harden your heart against the word of the Lord, then guess what? I'll give you what you want. I'll give you the lie. that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. When people are predisposed to follow their own agenda, to pursue their own agenda, and to, kind of embrace their own plans or their own vision of how things are to be, they set themselves up to reject the truth. And they believe the things that are meant to deceive them and lure them away. They believe things that just are not so. That's what happens. That's the end result. And because they are kind of they're headstrong in this and they're determined to do this, at some point, apparently, according to what Paul says here, God will turn them over to a strong delusion. They end up believing that the lie is the truth. Now, my opinion, there are a lot of people today, I think they've already made that transition. Just my opinion. Because they have rejected truth for so long and so, willingly, they believe things that just aren't so. And they believe these things are really right, noble, all these things. Anyway, I don't want to get into the politics of today. And so then we're reminded, once again, of the importance of hearing God, following his instructions, not falling short, not going beyond. But we're also reminded, or at least we're prompted to consider how important it is to hear God's voice by the Spirit, as opposed to listening to our own voice, which we so often allow to become God's voice. Let me say this again in a different way. We want what we want, and we want it so much that we ignore the word of the Lord and actually cause our soulish desires to become God's voice in our life. Now juxtapose that with Caleb and Joshua, because they heard God's voice. And one of the reasons that we know that they heard God's voice is because in spite of the obstacles, they knew that we can do this because God said it. They received it into their spirit, in other words. Not just their mind, but their spirit. So Numbers chapter 14, beginning in verse 6. Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of Israel, saying, the land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Don't rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land. They are our bread. He just reiterating that we can do this. And they acknowledge that these people don't have any protection. The Lord's with us. We shouldn't fear them. And so then if God has called us to go forward as a person, a family, a congregation, if he has called us to go forward, then we should expect that the opposition to that has been stripped of its power. That doesn't mean they just melt away. Those giants and fortified cities were still there. It just means they don't have any power. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's all a facade. It's this bully trying to intimidate. And one thing I think most of us learned growing up, you know how you deal with a bully, right? You pop him in the mouth. You punch him in the nose. Doesn't matter how big they are. You meet them behind the oak tree one night at a basketball game and you you punch them in the nose. And yeah, you take some licks in the process perhaps. Anyway, that's another story, right? But what we learn is that the opposition has been stripped of its power if the Lord delights in us and if we're doing what he's called us to do, and if we're going forward and believing in that. They're not going to devour us. To the contrary, they are our bread, Caleb says. So also we should take to heart what Moses told Israel in other passages. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 25, this day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the nations under the whole heaven, who shall hear the report of you and shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. So are you picking up that there's this juxtaposition between this report and that report? An evil report, we're to think on things that are of good report. And then to the generation that is going to go into the land, Moses says, these people over there that your fathers, your parents feared because of a report, they're going to hear the report of you now. And fear and dread is going to come upon them, and they shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. In other words, at a certain time, if we're doing what the Father has told us to do, and we're walking forward, believing that he goes before us as he promised he would do, then the one who had been intimidating us all this time is going to be intimidated. That we, because we are following him, are going to intimidate those who have tried to intimidate us. And it's not because of us, it's because of the one who is working in and through us. Deuteronomy 31 verse 6, be strong and of good courage, and do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you, and he will not leave you nor forsake you. So, all of these are very important lessons for us to learn. So, we have to believe what God says in spite of what we see in front of us. I need to believe what God said, what I heard God say, that's in my spirit. I need to believe that even over what my eyes may see. Because my eyes will speak to my soul, and my soul will lie like a dog to me. My emotions will take over and run me right into the ground. So I have to heed his voice over my own voice. Our internal voice can, if we let it, convince us of things that just are not so. And then on top of that, and here's a lesson, compel us to say things that we should never have said. Because you see, in this Torah portion we see that when we declare certain things, at times, those things that we declare that we shouldn't declare because they're based on a soulish voice or emotions or unbelief or what have you. But when we say those things, it sets other things in motion that cannot be undone. In this particular case, the spies and the people slandered the land of Israel. And I want to interject this for the sake of others who may be listening in places like, Gaza, Iran, Lebanon, and other places. Some of them are in Washington, D.C., all across the world. You better not slander the land of Israel. You just better not do that. Numbers chapter 13, verses 31 and 2. The men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against this people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. So they gave a bad report of the land. They slandered the land. So again, it is unwise to slander the land of Israel. It's unwise to slander something or someone that God has chosen and has appointed for his purpose. Because when you start slandering the land, you start slandering the thing, you start slandering the person that God has appointed, what you're really doing is you are slandering the Most High God. You're rejecting his purpose, you're slandering that, you're slandering him. So that's what Solomon said in Proverbs 10, whoever spreads slander is a fool. It's just stupid to do that. But what's the saying? Play stupid games, win stupid prizes, right? That's what happens. The Hebrew word that is translated evil report or bad report is actually the same word that is translated slander. They slandered the land. And the slander infected almost all of the congregation. Almost all. But the slander affected everyone in the congregation, even those who weren't infected by the slander. And I want us to think about that for just a moment. When somebody slanders, it has the power to infect whoever will receive it. But it also has the power to affect everybody in one way or the other. In reality, the evil report is what devoured the people of God, not the land. And so I've thought about this. Maybe that's why zarat, biblical leprosy, maybe that's why some people believe that it is the result of slander. Maybe that's why it leads to excommunication, because it's like a cancerous cell that works its way through. And it infects many, but it affects everybody. And so a cancerous cell, what has to happen? It has to be removed from the body for the sake of the body. And so then, slander, gossip, murmuring, how many times are we told through the wilderness journey that this is what they kept doing? Unbelief, murmuring, complaining, slandering, all this kind of stuff. And what is the usual outcome of those scenarios? Somebody dies. And what is the definition of, mine just went, insanity. Yes, thank you. Apparently that's where I'm headed. Anyway, definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. So murmuring and complaining never gets you what you want. It always gets you what you deserve. So then, what made the report evil? The fact that this slander undermined God's purpose for the body. Now, it accurately described what was in the land. It accurately described who was in the land. There were giants. There were fortified cities. That was not a lie. And so slander can contain truthful statements, but it's still evil. So the sin of the 10 spies was more than just thinking that they couldn't take the land. The report was evil because it convinced other people that we couldn't take the land. They instilled that fear and that unbelief and rejecting the word of the Lord in other people. They allowed their doubts to infect the nation and then affect the nation. And it actually, considering what God's purpose was and his intent was before all this happened, in that regard, their report altered the course of history. So let's think about that for just a moment. What we say, especially taking into consideration things that we should not, can alter the course of history. If we think about that, maybe it would be wise for us to listen more and speak less. Now, they did finally come around to, we're ready to go. But by that time, it was too late. Numbers 14, verse 40. And they rose early in the morning, and they went up to the top of the mountain, saying, "Here we are, and we will go up to the place which the Lord has promised, for we have sinned." And Moses says, "Now, why do you transgress the command of the Lord? You're just doing the same thing again. You're rejecting what the Lord has said." Because by this time, the Lord has said, you're not going into the land. You're going through the wilderness. Oh, but we have a better idea. We'll go up and we'll get ready. We'll go into the land. You transgress the command of the Lord. For this will not succeed. Do not go up, lest you be defeated by your enemies, for the Lord is not among you. What a fearful thought. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites are there before you, and you shall fall by the sword, because you have turned away from the Lord. The Lord will not be with you. So, another lesson we can take away from this is, God gives us windows of opportunity. And then there are times when that window of opportunity closes. And in this particular case, why did it close? Because people couldn't follow instructions. They had a different agenda, and in their mind, a better way. There were people who assumed authority and took liberties that were not granted to them. There were people who were not willing to hear the truth and consequently were more inclined to believe a lie. Why is it that we, even today, after reading this year after year after year, I mean, we've been doing this for decades. The people of God have been doing this for millennia. And how is it that we are still predisposed to believe a lie and reject the truth? And then believing the lie, they repeated the lie, and in repeating the lie, they discouraged others. And then they said things that should have never been said because they slandered God's purpose. So I think it would be wise for all of us, myself included, everybody who's watching on the live stream, it would be wise for us to consider all these lessons and to not repeat the mistakes that Israel made. Because all of us have a purpose just like they did. All of us have a reason that we are here, that God has placed us here at this time. We've come into the kingdom for such a time as this. And because we have a purpose, we have a responsibility to embrace that purpose. And in embracing that purpose, not to reject the word of the Lord. We should do now what needs to be done in order to fulfill that purpose, lest we find out that there was a window of opportunity and we didn't do what we should have done then, and then when we get ready to do it in our own sweet time, realize that the window of opportunity has closed. And so I can't think about that without thinking about the 5 foolish virgins. Of the 10, they all go out expecting to meet the bridegroom. They all have lamps. They have oil in their lamps. But you remember, the parable tells us what distinguishes the wise from the foolish. The wise had extra vessels with oil. The foolish did not. And you see, nobody counted on the bridegroom delaying his coming, and everybody falls asleep. And then when the shout comes that the bridegroom is on his way, everybody wakes up to trim their lamps, and the foolish find out then that, wow, our oil is going out. Give us some of yours. No. We did what we were supposed to do. And if we share with you now, none of us are going to get into the wedding. Go find some. Do what you should have already done. And so at midnight, they're going and knocking on people's door to try to find oil. And so by the time they did what they had already been instructed to do, if I can put it that way, by the time they got around to it, when it was convenient for them, they found out that they were locked out of the wedding. Matthew 25, verses 10 through 12. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. And afterward the other virgins came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered and said, Surely I say to you, I do not know you. Not only was the door shut, but he says, I don't know you. Anyway. So back to our Torah portion. 10 men out of millions. 10 men prevented an entire generation from fulfilling their God-ordained purpose. 10 men. Using nothing more than words. Now, again, God dealt with them. They were cut out, almost immediately. But the damage was done because that evil report had spread throughout the congregation. There was a generation that believed that report. Now, Moses intercedes for them. God bless Moses. I know he had days when he was saying, God, kill me now. Just please, let's be done with this and kill me. These people are driving me insane. Yeah, there were days that he's like, you bunch of rebels, and he whacked that rock twice when he was only supposed to speak to it. But then there are those days when these people are acting like this and God's ready to wipe them out. I'm not lying to you. I know what I would have done. I'd have stepped aside. Go for it. Have at it. And that's why I'm not Moses and I didn't get that job, okay? But he says, don't do that. Don't do that, because if you do that, here's what the Egyptians are going to say. And the Egyptians are going to agree with these people that you're so mad at right now. Don't do that. And he pardoned him. I'm going to pardon them for your sake, Moses. But I'm telling you this, not a single one of them are going to see the land that they have slandered. The only exceptions I'm making are Joshua and Caleb. So then, the people are pardoned, but the people suffered decades of consequence. But here's what I want you to see. I'm almost done here. Their unbelief, yeah, there were consequences that they had to pay. But their unbelief affected more than just the ones who complained and rebelled. Numbers 15, verse 31. The Lord speaks and says, your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses, I have a childhood memory when I hear that word, every time I hear it. You know, sentences like, Billy Cloud, get your carcass in this house right now. Billy Cloud, get your carcass out of that car right now. Sometimes my dad didn't even have to say the word. All he had to do was ride down the road and go like that. And that meant you better get your carcass home right now. Anyway, but as for you, your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years. And listen to this. This is what I wanted to emphasize. And bear the brunt of your infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness. Now, it is true that the children were permitted to enter into the land, but not before they had borne the brunt of their parents' infidelity. And that word infidelity literally means unfaithfulness. It's also a word that can be translated harlotry. In other words, any unbelief, any rebellion that we exhibit today has the potential, has the power to negatively affect our children, who may come into the fruition of what God's called them to do, but maybe not until they have borne the brunt of this generation's infidelity. So when we do the things that are contrary to the will of God, as you know, is expressed in this particular Torah portion, we're doing harm not to just to ourselves and not just to others, but we're doing harm, potentially anyway, to our children and to our grandchildren. And so the things that we exhibit that are not pleasing to God can, not saying definitely will, but can negatively affect our children. They may not repeat our mistakes, but they may suffer for them. I don't think any of us want that. All right, I'll have some final thoughts here, and then I'll finish. I'm reading, Numbers chapter 13, the spies. Numbers 14, the people murmuring and complaining and all the different things that happened there. And then I turned the page to Numbers 15. And initially it's like, this thing just took a hard left turn and went out here into something completely different. But I want to consider something. The narrative that follows in the next chapter, that is Numbers chapter 15. The instructions are concerning different offerings that were to be made and laws pertaining to unintentional sins. And if you'll read it, again, you'll notice that when you come into the land pops up a couple of times. Now, he's just told a group of people, you're not going into the land. And then he tells, in a matter of speaking to that next generation, who are children at the time, but when you come into the land, it's almost as if he's emphasizing that, number one, for the people who would actually enter into the land, but also serving as a reminder that there are many who are not going to go into the land. There are many people who are not going to get to do this because of all this other nonsense. And then it begins to emphasize what you do if you commit a sin unintentionally as opposed to doing something intentionally. So I'm going to read beginning at verse 30. But the person who does anything presumptuously, intentionally, somebody who does something defiantly is what he's saying here. Whether he is a native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach on the Lord. You dishonor God's name and reputation when you do something intentional like that. That person shall be cut off from among his people. Why? Because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his covenant. That person shall be completely cut off. His guilt shall be upon him. Now, immediately it says, now while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. And they put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And so as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. I almost titled this message, Sticks and Stones, but I thought that was a little too provocative. But now, think about this for a moment. Think about what we've read in the previous chapters 13, 14, what it's been dealing with. And now he comes to us and tells us, when you get into the land, there's certain offerings you're going to bring, etc. And then he talks to us about what you can do if you unintentionally transgress the law of the Lord versus what happens when you intentionally transgress the law of the Lord. The person who acts presumptuously, he says, brings reproach on the Lord because he despised the word of the Lord. Now, where this guy who was gathering sticks and they put him in jail for a little while to see what's supposed to happen, and the Lord comes back and says, this guy's got to die. And they take him out and stone him. In the 21st century, reading that seems a bit harsh. It seems like, wow, that's kind of over the top, isn't it, for going out and gathering sticks. But when you look at the Hebrew text, there's something there that I think jumps out that's not so obvious when we read it in English. The phrase presumptuous, or the Hebrew phrase that is translated presumptuously. In Hebrew, it's biyad urama. Biyad urama. Rama is something that it's high, elevated. Biyad, with a hand. And so it literally means with a high hand. It's something that is done with the intent to be belligerent, to be defiant, like somebody who shakes their fist at God and dares him to act, that kind of thing. I mean, because when we want to show defiance in the face of something, what do? Now, there can be good connotations and there can be evil connotations. What we're talking about here is a man who went out with the intent to beguile. It was intentional. It was intended to incite others to follow his lead. And that's why this word is also translated as treachery. And treachery is deserving of the death sentence. In other words, what I'm saying here is this guy essentially did the same thing that the 10 spies did. The 10 spies caused the people to doubt, to rebel, to sin, to reject the word of the Lord. This guy is intentionally going out to do pretty much the same thing. So then, it's a dangerous thing for us to be so intent on self and so focused on self and, convince ourselves that our opinion, our agenda, or we have a better way. It's really dangerous for us to do that to the point that we neglect the word of the Lord or reject the word of the Lord. And in rejecting the word of the Lord, we neglect our calling. It's what this guy was doing was basically despising the word of the Lord. That's the same thing that the spies did. That's the same thing that the people did in embracing the lie that was presented to them by the 10 spies. And so if we do that, if we get so focused on my opinion, my agenda, my thing, allowing my soulish voice to become God's voice, allowing what I want, my flesh, to become God's voice. Well, I feel like God is telling me this, and he's convinced me of that. And there's some cases when people tell me that, I'm like, no, he didn't. God didn't tell you that. I tread carefully, Bill. There have been times that God has told me, when people have come to me and said, God told me that this is what we need to do. And I said, well, gosh, that's interesting, because God was telling me something exact opposite of that. So one of us is wrong. One of us isn't hearing from God. I wonder who it is. Because I wonder how God does things from the very beginning of time. We cannot allow our soulish voice to become God's voice for us just so we can put some facade of holiness on it in order to get our way. Now, let me pause before I finish and say this, because this is what sometimes will happen. I will say things like this because the Torah portion's teaching on it, and people go, I wonder what's wrong. I wonder who he's talking to. Because that's the way our minds work. So can I please tell you, I'm not talking to anyone in particular. I'm talking to me. And I'm talking to all of us. Because we're all God's people. And we are all susceptible to the same things as those people were in those days. Because people haven't changed. Right? So put your minds at ease that I am not talking to a particular situation or to a particular person. However, if you're that concerned about it, maybe you should stop and reflect, am I guilty of any of these things? Do I need to work on some of this? And by the way, the answer to that is yes, of course. Because you see, when we get so focused on self and to the point that we're going to do what they did, instill fear in others, instill doubt in others, we're basically repeating the sin of the 10 spies, and it didn't work out good for them. We don't need to give into fear, and then we don't need to give into doubt and unbelief, and then slander God's purpose. Because if we do that, how can we fulfill our purpose in the Lord? You've heard me share this before. When they discouraged their brethren, and that's what it says, our brethren have discouraged our hearts. When we discourage our brethren through grumbling, complaining, in essence, what we're doing is we're stealing what courage they may have had. We're stealing their courage. We're taking it away from them. And it's likely because we didn't have any courage to start with. You can't encourage somebody if you don't have courage. But you can discourage somebody if you don't. And so we don't need to rob someone else of their courage. If they are on board with God's purpose and God's vision, then don't be the one to steal that from them. If we'll be sensitive to His Spirit, we're not going to discourage anybody. We're going to encourage our brethren, because that's what He would do. And if we're going to encourage our brother, that means we need to have some courage to encourage him with. And if we're going to have courage, then that means that we're going to have to be kind of like Caleb. Focused. Yeah, I saw the same things you saw, but what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is what God promised us. We have to be different from those other spies. We have to be different, like Caleb was different. We have to have that other spirit, right? I mean, he received the word of the Lord and he lived to see it fulfilled because he was of a different spirit. So it's very important, ladies and gentlemen, that we happily, readily embrace the word of the Lord. Let's not be those people who despise the word of the Lord, regardless of what it demands of our flesh. Amen.